You feel like an animal when you are in prison. You feel like an animal when you're in that cage. So I wanted to.
The house in Chilmark was quiet that morning. Too quiet for a place where an artist's life had just come to an end. John Forté, a name etched into hip-hop history through the score, a man once surrounded by studios, collaborators, and noise, was found dead inside his own home on Martha's Vineyard. There were no signs of a break-in. No immediate evidence of violence. No clear explanation offered to the public. Police would say there was no indication of foul play. Medical examiners would say the cause of death was not yet known. And in that narrow gap between those two statements, a question began to echo: what really happened in John Forté's final hours? This was not a man fading quietly into obscurity. Just years earlier, his life had already defied probability, from the heights of global success to a federal prison sentence that shocked the music world, and then to a rare presidential commutation that gave him a second chance at life. He had survived what most never do. So why did his story end here, in silence, on a peaceful island? To understand how John Forté arrived at that final moment, we have to slow time down. To walk backward through the last day, the last weeks, and the long road that led him from the center of a cultural earthquake to a solitary room where the music finally stopped. The news traveled faster than the tide around Martha's Vineyard. Within hours, headlines appeared with the same unsettling phrasing: John Forté found dead at home. The language was careful, almost restrained, no dramatic accusations, no definitive answers. Just absence. And that absence was enough to send a ripple through the music world. For many listeners, John Forté's name lived quietly in liner notes and credits. But for those who knew the history, his death landed with weight. He was not just a contributor to the score. He was part of a moment when hip-hop crossed borders and became a global language. His words, his production instincts, his presence behind the scenes had helped shape an album that sold millions and defined an era. Now, the man who helped build that sound was gone, and the circumstances were unclear. Artists who had crossed paths with Forté reacted with disbelief. Some posted brief messages, grief condensed into a sentence, a date, a broken heart emoji. Others stayed silent, as if unsure how to respond to a death that offered no narrative, no explanation, no closure. Silence itself became a form of reaction. Journalists moved quickly but cautiously. Reports emphasized what authorities were willing to say, that there were no immediate signs of foul play, that an investigation was ongoing, that a medical examiner would determine the cause of death. What they did not say was just as striking. No timeline. No cause. No final event that could be pointed to and understood. For longtime fans, the shock carried a second layer. John Forté's life had already included one ending that felt final. Years earlier, when he was sentenced to a long federal prison term, many believed his career, and perhaps his life, was effectively over. Yet he had returned. He had rebuilt. He had spoken openly about redemption, about survival, about the fragile gift of a second chance. That history made the suddenness of this moment harder to process. Online, speculation began almost immediately. Not accusations, but questions. Was this related to the health incident he had suffered the year before? Had he been struggling quietly, away from the public eye? Or was this simply a tragic, unpreventable event that defied narrative altogether? Each question underscored the same truth: John Forté's death did not arrive with an explanation that fit neatly into a headline. The contrast was impossible to ignore. A man whose life once unfolded in front of cameras, courtrooms, and crowds now exited the world in a place defined by privacy. No stage lights. No courtroom drama. Just a house, an island, and a waiting silence. And that silence invites us to look backward, not to sensationalize his death, but to understand the life that led to it. Because John Forté's final hours cannot be separated from the journey that came before, the rise, the fall, and the long attempt to outrun both. Before John Forté became a footnote in a police report or a headline about an unanswered death, he was a young artist searching for a voice in a crowded, unforgiving industry. Born and raised in New York City, Forté came of age at a time when hip-hop was still negotiating its identity, part street poetry, part commercial force, part political weapon. He was never the loudest person in the room, never the most visible. His talent lived in the margins, in phrasing, in structure, in the way ideas were stitched together behind the scenes. In the early 1990s, Forté moved through studios the way some people move through libraries, quietly, observantly, absorbing everything. He wrote. He produced. He collaborated. His skill was not in dominating the spotlight but in shaping what happened just outside of it. Those who worked with him later described a mind that moved quickly, restlessly, always looking for the connective tissue between sound, message, and emotion. That instinct led him to a creative circle that would soon change his life. When the Fugees were assembling what would become the score, Forté was there, contributing verses, ideas, and structural elements that helped give the album its depth. Released in 1996, the score was not just a commercial success. It was a cultural moment. It crossed racial and geographic boundaries, blending hip-hop with soul, reggae, and social commentary. The album sold millions, dominated charts, and turned its creators into global figures. From the outside, it looked like a rival. Industry recognition. Financial stability. Access. Forté was suddenly in rooms that most artists never reach. But even at the height of that success, his position was complicated. He was essential, yet not famous in the conventional sense. His name was known to insiders, to musicians, to critics who read credits carefully. To the broader public, he remained largely invisible. That invisibility carried a quiet pressure. Fame shields some artists by giving them power and resources. Being adjacent to fame can do the opposite. Forté watched as others became household names while he remained in the background, his contributions real but easily overlooked. For some, that role is comfortable. For others, it creates a subtle erosion, a sense of being indispensable yet replaceable, present yet unseen. As the late 1990s unfolded, the industry around him shifted. The business of hip-hop became faster, harder, more transactional. Opportunities expanded, but so did temptations. Money moved quickly. So did risk. Forté's life began to fill with contradictions, creative success paired with personal instability, professional respect existing alongside private chaos. Then came the moment that would fracture everything. In 2000, John Forté was arrested and later convicted on federal drug charges. The details shocked those who knew him. He was not a street-level dealer, not a caricature of criminal excess. Yet the sentence handed down was severe, 14 years in federal prison. In a single courtroom decision, the arc of his life bent sharply downward. The music world reacted with disbelief. Artists, executives, and advocates argued that the punishment far exceeded the crime. They pointed to Forté's role as an artist, a father, a contributor to culture. But the system was unmoved. The door closed, and Forté entered a reality that could not have been further from the studios where his career had begun. Prison stripped away context. There were no liner notes there. No collaborators. No applause. Just time, slow, unyielding time, and the weight of knowing that the peak of his career had ended not with a fade-out, but with a sentence. For many, that would have been the end of the story. But it wasn't. In an extraordinary turn, Forté's case attracted high-level attention. Advocates continued to argue that his sentence was disproportionate. Years passed. Then, in 2008, his sentence was commuted by the President of the United States. After 7 years behind bars, John Forté walked free. The moment was framed publicly as redemption. A second chance. Proof that the system, occasionally, could correct itself. Forté himself spoke with gratitude and humility. He talked about lessons learned, about responsibility, about rebuilding. To the world, it looked like a miracle. But second chances come with their own weight. Freedom did not mean a return to the life he had left behind. The industry had changed. Relationships had shifted. Time had moved on without him. Forté re-entered the world as a man older, marked by incarceration, carrying both hope and invisible scars. He continued to make music, releasing deeply introspective work shaped by loss, faith, regret, and survival. His later projects were quieter, more inward-looking. They did not chase charts. They asked questions instead. About identity. About punishment. About what it means to rebuild a life that once collapsed under public scrutiny. On the surface, John Forté had survived the worst. He had fallen, been buried, and emerged again. But survival is not the same as peace. And as the years passed, subtle signs suggested that the distance between the men he had been and the life he was living was still difficult to bridge. Those unresolved tensions would matter. Because the road to Chilmark did not begin in that quiet house. It began decades earlier, in the spaces between recognition and obscurity, between success and punishment, between being saved and being truly healed. Redemption stories often end too early. They stop at the moment the prison gates open, at the photograph of a man stepping back into daylight. What they rarely show is the long, quiet aftermath, the years when applause fades and reality sets in. For John Forté, freedom did not erase the damage. It simply revealed it. After his release, Forté spoke publicly about responsibility and gratitude, but beneath those words was a life that had been permanently altered. Incarceration had taken years that could never be replaced. It had interrupted relationships, reshaped his identity, and forced him to carry a label that never fully disappeared. Even when doors reopened, they did not open the same way. The music industry he returned to was colder, faster, and less forgiving. The collaborative ecosystem that once nurtured him had shifted. New stars dominated attention. Streaming replaced physical sales. Loyalty was no longer currency. Forté continued to work, continued to create, but his output reflected a man processing trauma rather than chasing relevance. His later albums were heavy with introspection. The lyrics lingered on guilt, loss, faith, and endurance. He spoke about prison not as a chapter, but as a shadow that followed him. Interviews hinted at the psychological toll of confinement, the constant vigilance, the erosion of trust, the difficulty of reconnecting with a world that had moved on. Freedom, he suggested, was not a switch that flipped back on. It was a negotiation, repeated daily. Behind the scenes, personal pressures mounted. Forté was a husband and a father, roles that carried both grounding purpose and immense responsibility. Rebuilding a life after public disgrace is not a solitary task, it affects everyone connected to you. Expectations, internal and external, can become relentless. To be grateful. To be productive. To prove that the second chance was deserved. There were also health concerns. In the year before his death, Forté reportedly experienced a serious medical incident, a seizure, that drew quiet attention but little public discussion. He recovered, but such events leave traces. They raise questions about vulnerability, about the body's fragility after years of stress, about warning signs that are easy to minimize once the immediate danger passes. Isolation became a defining feature of his later life. While he remained connected to the creative community, Forté increasingly withdrew from the spotlight. He chose spaces that offered distance from the noise of the industry and the reminders of his past. Martha's Vineyard, with its reputation for privacy and calm, fit that need. It was a place where he could be John, not a symbol of success or failure. Yet isolation is a double-edged refuge. It offers peace, but it also removes witnesses. Without daily contact, struggles can deepen unnoticed. The very quiet that allows healing can also conceal decline. Friends and collaborators would later describe Forté as thoughtful, searching, and deeply reflective. But reflection can slide into rumination. The weight of unresolved questions, about justice, about wasted time, about identity, does not vanish simply because life appears stable from the outside. For someone who had lived through extremes, normalcy itself could feel disorienting. What makes this chapter of Forté's life so crucial is not scandal or spectacle, but accumulation. There was no single collapse, no headline-grabbing meltdown. Instead, there was a gradual layering of pressures, psychological scars from prison, the challenge of reintegration, health concerns, creative displacement, and the quiet loneliness of a man who had once stood near the center of cultural history. This slow burn matters because it reframes his death. It suggests that the final moment was not isolated, not a random interruption of an otherwise peaceful life, but the endpoint of a long, complex struggle that never fully resolved. As the months passed, Forté's world narrowed. Projects slowed. Public appearances became rarer. And then, without warning, the story shifted from introspection to investigation. Because in the weeks leading up to his death, something changed. In the weeks before his death, John Forté's life appeared outwardly calm. There were no public crises, no dramatic statements, no visible unraveling that would later be replayed on news loops. That absence of spectacle would become one of the most unsettling aspects of what followed. Forté had settled into a quieter rhythm. Friends describe a man who was reflective, deliberate, and increasingly inward-looking. His days were structured but sparse, time spent writing, reading, listening, thinking. The pace was slower than the life he once lived, but not empty. It was the kind of stillness that can signal peace, or conceal exhaustion. There were no major upcoming releases announced. No tour schedules. No promotional cycles demanding attention. For an artist who had spent years negotiating his place in an industry that moved relentlessly forward, this pause could be interpreted in two ways. Either he had finally stepped off the treadmill, or he was searching for a direction that had not yet revealed itself. Those close to him knew about the health scare he had experienced the previous year. A seizure is not something that fades easily from memory, not for the person who experiences it, and not for those who witness the aftermath. Even when recovery appears complete, it leaves behind an awareness of vulnerability. The body, once trusted, has proven capable of betrayal. Yet there were no public warnings in the days that followed. No emergency calls reported. No known hospital visits in the immediate lead-up. Whatever concerns existed were private, handled quietly, without the kind of signals that invite intervention from the outside world. As the final week approached, Forté remained on Martha's Vineyard. The island was beginning to settle into its off-season calm, fewer visitors, shorter days, longer nights. The environment reinforced solitude. The ocean air, the narrow roads, the sense of being physically removed from the mainland all contributed to a feeling of separation from urgency. In the last known stretch of time before his death, Forté was not surrounded by a crowd. There was no entourage, no studio session filled with collaborators. He was where he had chosen to be, at home. What he did in those final days remains largely undocumented. No final interview surfaced. No farewell message was released. No cryptic social media post later reinterpreted as a warning sign. That absence has become its own kind of evidence, a reminder that not all endings announce themselves. For viewers, this creates a deeply unsettling question. If there were no obvious alarms, no public collapse, no clear trajectory toward disaster, then how do we make sense of the final moment when everything stopped? The answer lies not in a single action, but in the accumulation of context. A life marked by extremes. Years of psychological pressure. A serious health incident. Increasing isolation. And a man who had learned, perhaps too well, how to carry weight silently. As the final day arrived, there was nothing to suggest that it would be different from the days before it. Until it was. The final day began without urgency. No sirens. No frantic calls. Just the ordinary stillness of a private home on an island where time moves differently. What is known, according to reports, is limited, and that limitation shapes the story as much as any confirmed fact. In the hours leading up to his death, John Forté was at home in Chilmark. There is no public record of visitors arriving or leaving that day. No confirmed appointments. No documented disputes. The house, by all accounts, was undisturbed. Doors were intact. The scene offered no immediate explanation for what was about to be discovered. As daylight shifted and shadows lengthened, the island continued its routine. Roads emptied. The sound of wind through trees replaced the noise of summer crowds. Inside that house, time passed in a way no one else could see. At some point, the precise hour has not been publicly confirmed, John Forté died. When he was found, authorities were careful with their language. There were no signs of forced entry. No indication of foul play. No visible trauma that could instantly answer the most obvious question: how did this happen? Instead, the scene presented a stillness that defied interpretation. For investigators, that kind of quiet is not reassuring. It is challenging. When a death offers no immediate clues, the work shifts from response to reconstruction. Medical examiners step in. Toxicology tests are ordered. Medical history is reviewed. The process becomes slower, more methodical, and more opaque to the public. What is clear is what did not happen. There was no immediate declaration of cause. Northwest rushed to close the case. The absence of certainty lingered in official statements, leaving space for speculation but offering none themselves. For those trying to understand the final hours, the lack of detail is unsettling. Humans instinctively search for sequences, a last conversation, a final action, a clear turning point. In this case, those moments are either unknown or private. There is no verified final call to quote. No documented last words. No final message that can be replayed and analyzed. Instead, the final hours exist as negative space. What can be said, with caution, is that Forté's death did not occur in public. There was no collapse on stage, no emergency broadcast, no crowd of witnesses. He died away from spectacle, in the same quiet he had increasingly chosen for himself. For some, that feels peaceful. For others, it feels deeply troubling. Because when someone with a history of extreme pressure, incarceration, and health concerns dies suddenly without explanation, the mind fills the silence with questions. Was there an underlying medical condition? Did the earlier seizure play a role? Was this an unforeseeable event, or the final consequence of a long, invisible strain? At this stage, authorities did not answer those questions. They deferred to the medical examiner. And in doing so, they placed John Forté's final hours into a limbo that mirrored much of his later life, present, real, deeply felt, but only partially understood. As news of his death spread, the focus began to shift. From the quiet house. From the unanswered final moments. Toward what would come next. Because death, especially an unexplained one, does not end a story. It changes its direction. In the days after John Forté's death, the silence around the case became louder than any headline. Official statements remained brief and careful, repeating the same restrained phrases: no signs of foul play, investigation ongoing, cause of death pending. For authorities, this was procedure. For the public, it was an open-ended sentence. Medical examiners began their work away from cameras. This stage of an investigation rarely produces immediate answers, especially when a death presents without visible trauma. Toxicology screens take time. Reviews of medical history require documentation. Every conclusion must be supported, not assumed. Until that process is complete, uncertainty remains the only honest position. That uncertainty created a vacuum, and vacuums never stay empty for long. Media outlets resisted speculation, but discussion still unfolded in quieter spaces. Fans revisited old interviews, searching for hints they might have missed. Mentions of Forté's prior seizure resurfaced, not as proof of anything, but as a reminder that his health had not been invulnerable. Others pointed to the psychological toll of incarceration, noting how trauma can linger long after freedom is restored. Some asked whether isolation played a role. Living alone, by choice, can be restorative. But it can also mean that emergencies go unnoticed. In cases like this, questions arise not from suspicion, but from empathy, from the human instinct to imagine how a tragedy might have been prevented. More extreme theories surfaced at the margins, as they often do when information is scarce. These narratives rarely offered evidence, only discomfort with ambiguity. But none were supported by facts, and none were echoed by investigators. The absence of foul play was consistently emphasized, even as final conclusions remained pending. For Forté's family, this period was defined by waiting. Waiting for clarity. Waiting for a cause. Waiting for a language that could make sense of loss. Public curiosity does not pause for grief, and the overlap between investigation and mourning is often cruel. Each update, or lack of one, reopened the wound. What distinguishes this case is not scandal, but restraint. There were no leaks, no dramatic reversals, no courtroom battles. Just a slow, methodical process unfolding behind closed doors. And that restraint, paradoxically, made the story more haunting. Without a definitive narrative, the mind is left to circle the same questions. Why now? Why here? Why after surviving so much already? As weeks passed, attention gradually shifted from investigation to remembrance. Tributes replaced speculation. The focus moved away from how John Forté died, and back toward who he was, and what his life had meant to those who knew his work. But even as the conversation softened, the unresolved nature of his death remained part of the story. Not as an accusation. Not as a mystery to be solved by outsiders. But as a reminder that some endings do not come with explanations, only consequences. And it is often only by stepping back, by looking at the full arc of a life, that those endings begin to make sense. When the questions finally quieted, what remained was the shape of a life that refused to fit into a simple ending. John Forté will always be linked to the score, to a moment when hip-hop found a wider voice and spoke with uncommon depth. His work helped define an era, even if his name was never printed in the largest type. That legacy alone would have secured him a place in music history. But Forté's story extends beyond credits and charts. It is a story about proximity to greatness, about how being essential does not always mean being protected. It is about how the machinery of success can elevate some while quietly grinding others down. And it is about how punishment, once imposed, continues to echo long after a sentence is served. In the years after his release, Forté gave voice to experiences many never articulate. His later music was not triumphant, it was honest. It spoke of loss without spectacle, of faith without certainty, of survival without celebration. Those records may not have dominated playlists, but they carried something rarer, testimony. They were proof that endurance leaves marks, and that art can become a way of living with them. His death, quiet and unresolved, forces an uncomfortable reflection. We often look for meaning in final moments, for a clear lesson or a definitive cause. But sometimes the lesson is that life does not provide neat conclusions. Sometimes the final hours are not dramatic, but silent. Not public, but private. And that silence can be as revealing as any explanation. If John Forté's life teaches anything when viewed from its end, it is this: redemption is not an endpoint. Survival is not the same as healing. And the absence of visible crisis does not mean the absence of struggle. These truths are easy to overlook in a culture that rewards spectacle and forgets the slow weight of time. Today, Forté is remembered by those who study liner notes, by artists who understand the cost of creation, and by listeners who hear something deeper in his later work. He leaves behind a family, a body of art shaped by extremes, and a story that resists simplification. In the quiet house on Martha's Vineyard, the music stopped without explanation. But the echo of what came before it still lingers, in songs, in memories, and in the uncomfortable questions we carry long after the final hour has passed.